I invite you to take your Bibles, please, and turn to Acts, the 24th chapter. We're in lesson number 21. We're in the midst of Paul defending himself before the Jewish Sanhedrin in connection with the procurators of the provinces that are set forth. We're meeting up with Felix. We'll meet up with Festus and all the things that are connected with his imprisonment in Caesarea, not Rome, not Jerusalem, but in Caesarea. So that's what we're in the midst of. You talked last week about Felix postponed his decision concerning Paul, and you talked about that. So this evening, I want us to look at what happens after this and deal with the freedoms that were being allowed by Felix. Question number 22, I think you touched on this, is around the word indulgence that we see there in the American Standard Version, like house arrests or something like that. I think Joel presented to us, and that's a pretty good imagery. But it's the idea of making lax what would be an imprisonment, relaxing things, maybe house imprisonment, so to speak, but giving him some freedoms where he might not be put in chains all the time. If that happened, he's going to have some. We know he's going to have his friends come. That's the part that we see there taking place, and not to forbid any of his friends to minister unto him. When we think about Felix, and we're getting ready to see his character set forth, it's amazing to me how much we talk about the Bible being the truth. We're looking at Luke giving a historical documentation that we have forever with people who are in the Roman government, and their character seems to come out the way just Luke said so. We wouldn't miss this. Tacitus says that Felix was emperor ruling as a slave. Proverbs speaks about that. You don't want a slave ruling over you, because sometimes they want to get even. They don't like people with money. They're going to get after you. And sometimes the slaves are the worst ones to be involved in ruling over you. Felix and his brother Paulus were indeed slaves, and the household slaves of Agrippina, the mother of Claudius Caesar. And Caesar began to be fond of Felix, but his character was not one that ruled well, even though Tertullius just brags on how wonderful his rule is. But we see his character, along with Drusilla, we see this taking place in verse 26 when he really, we're going to see what he really was after, and what he did with Paul after this. But at this point, Felix wanted him he knew of the way, didn't know what all the details of being a Christian necessarily, but he knew about the way. He knew a lot of the disagreements would be over Paul preaching the resurrection, for example. He knew about the way from the standpoint of the religious aspect of it. Not that he was an enemy to Caesar necessarily, or not that he violated any laws worthy of death. But he knew that, so he kind of delaying things. And I would determine the matter when the chief captain, that's Claudius Lysias, would come, and we don't have any indication he ever came. He sent a letter to introduce him to Felix, but he hadn't come down yet. So he wanted him to be kept in charge, should have indulgence or freedoms, be lax a little bit in how you treat him as a prisoner normally, and not to forbid any of his friends to minister, to come to his aid, to do some things for him that be helpful to his body or his disposition, that sort of thing that takes place. So what happens here is that when he comes, we have his wife named. What is her name? After certain days, Felix came with whom? Drusilla, and we identified her earlier in our question. We identified Tertullius, which we didn't have a lot of information about, other than he was an orator. Doesn't mean he was a Jew. A lot of these people came from the eastern orators, came from the east, and but he was one that could well speak. How he told half truths in order to establish his point is just it's interesting that he's a pestilent fellow. He's a ringleader. He profaned the temple. That's the three charges against Paul. And none of them were true. Yes, there was, he was purifying certain people, Gentiles, Jews from Asia, and they're the ones that are going to pick after him, that he brought in a Gentile in the temple, profaned it, but none of that happened. But he made it sound like that's a plausible thing that takes place. Well, here is Drusilla, and we know Josephus speaks about Drusilla somewhat in his Antiquities of the Jews. She was married at the age of what? When do you think she got married? She's 14 years old. My grandmother was married at 14 years old. So I don't have a problem with that. It's kind of young, isn't it? But she's married to a king. And a lot of this because of her beauty, that she was indeed married earlier to the king, and a lot of that was dealing with ways of pleasing people for political reasons. But what happened, she became married to Felix. Felix wanted her. She was that beautiful. Just ask her sister Bernice, that we're going to talk about. She was the youngest of three sisters, Marimene and Bernice and Drusilla. History says that Bernice was very jealous of Drusilla's beauty. So at the age of 14, she's married, but Felix gets her induced by a sorcerer to come away from that marriage. So you have a sorcerer employed by Felix, and in order to show that this is not a good thing to be married to, tell us who was the king there. What helped it is that he was very cruel to her. So well, I need a way out. Well, here is the gods telling us that said, by sorcery, that you need to leave him. And that's what she does, and becomes Felix's wife. She was the daughter of Agrippa the First. What do you know about Agrippa the First from the book of Acts? Let me just take you back. What happened in first part of Acts 12? AD 44, around that particular time. And she was about 6 or 8 at that time. He killed the Apostle James. He's the one that is in Acts the 12th chapter eaten by worms. He didn't give God the glory. That's her dad. And she was one that came from that background as well to marry Felix. And the whole point of her life of leaving one just because a sorcerer says you ought to do that and then Felix getting what he wants all the time. That was what he was after. It paints a picture of why Paul does what he does. And so we ask the question, why was Felix terrified when he heard Paul preach? Let me begin. Did they want to hear the word from Paul? Could have been Drusilla wanted to hear that. It seemed like both were involved in that. After a certain days, Felix came with Drusilla, his wife. She was a Jewess, so she was from the Jewish background. Sent for Paul, whether she's the one that wanted it or both of them were involved. Both of them are going to hear the word preached to them. But he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the word. Wanted to hear Paul preach the word. But what we see here, what aspect of that word? The faith which is in whom? Christ. And who is he? Jesus. He's Christ Jesus. And he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He came out of Nazareth. We got him pinpoint. That's Jesus. But he's Jesus the Christ, or Christ Jesus, the Messiah, the chosen one of God, the anointed one of God. And they wanted to hear a word from Paul. And we realized, well, that might be nice. So why didn't Paul preach to them the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus? He sure did preach the resurrection a lot to the Jews, didn't he? Jerusalem. That's what gets him in trouble. He preaches the resurrection because the Pharisees believed in the resurrection and Sadducees did. He divided and conquered. He did that. But just hear the word, Paul. And commentators say, well, I think he knew the character of Felix. He probably knew some things about Drusilla. I don't know. But did he preach what they needed to know? I say, yeah. Reason of righteousness. Why are you leaving your husband? It's not right to do that. Sorcery is not going to be the reason for that. Why would you leave your husband? And that's self-control. Felix, why don't you control yourself and not be enamored with your desire for her, being mesmerized by her beauty. What about the judgment to come? That doesn't sound like salvation in Jesus Christ. But those are the three things that he preached. And that was we see the result of that. Why do you think that would terrify Felix? David? You're guilty of all two, and the judgment's coming, isn't it? He's not self-control, not in righteousness. Her background wasn't too good either, about her leaving her husband based upon what we know from history. And so about 54 AD, she marries Felix. And here we see that his wife. She is a Jewess, and that's his wife. They hear this. But we see what Felix's whole point of view was different. Well, I just want to hear they'll preach the gospel. That's really what I care about. So when he was terrified by what Paul preached, I think it painted his picture. And there's a great example. Not that you with the faith in Jesus Christ, he could cover that, but those were the 3 points that he stresses because that's how they were living. They weren't living showing that, and you're going to go to the judgment. So one day, Drusilla and Felix and Paul will go to the judgment, stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And as Paul has done before in all of his work, blood of their salvation, of the idea of their soul is going to be lost. Their blood will not be on Paul's hands. Why? He preached the whole counsel of God. He preached what they needed to know. And he warned them of that. And there's no indication that they changed their mind about it, or Felix especially. He didn't change his mind because we see his whole motives was not really to hear the faith of Jesus Christ. And Paul may have known that about his character and about her character. They really say they want to hear that. But he may have changed his approach just because he knew what we're going to learn here in verse 26. Any comments on what caused him to be terrified? And there is your opportunity to go preach, and you don't ever want to terrify anybody. You would never think that'd be the last thing to do. But that's what the inspired apostle Paul did as he reasoned from the scriptures of reality that indeed this will be ahead of them both. And they can't say, Paul, you never told me. And they will spend eternity knowing they had that opportunity and also know the motives behind why they want to hear him preach anyway. That's not going to be a good way to end up in hell and eternal damnation. So any comments you want to make about Drusilla? Did you do some? I know Joel did some study on that, and he could maybe provide some more. But those are kind of the sketchy details about her and about Felix. Let's learn some more about Felix in this. Well, let me come back. What was his point? Why was Felix terrified when he heard Paul preach? And just talk about when he heard that. What he had hoped withal is that he would hear the gospel one more time and obey it. He would, without money, he would be given to him of Paul. Where would he get the idea that Paul had money? Get any indication why Felix would? We all know his character was such as that. just to get ahead, everything's for his benefit. But what would indicate that Paul had money? It makes us go back to why he entered Jerusalem in the first place. What was he carrying with him when he came to Jerusalem? How did Felix know this? When Paul makes his defense, if he didn't know it before, we find that Paul makes his defense in verse 16. Here I also exercise myself to have conscience void of offense toward God and men always. And by the way, that's the point he makes when he's collecting the money from the churches in Macedonia and Achaia, that he's going to be honorable of bringing that money to the saints there. He said, now after some years I came to bring what to my nation? Alms. That's going to be money, means of exchange, to help those who are poor, to bring alms to my nations and offerings, amidst which they found me purified in the temple. So that little indication, I brought alms. Felix had an understanding of the way in which people maybe interacted with one another. Christians are very generous. They're ones helping in Jerusalem, helping one another when the gospel was first preached and took care. That didn't just keep silent between the synagogues or where the Christians might be meeting, or the temple. People know about that. And he may have thought, well, they're very generous people. I'm also doing him a favor, giving him freedoms that maybe other prisoners might not have. But I commanded my centurion to, let him have some freedom, let his people come to him. And the reason we want to come here and preach, they thought they would get money out of him. An idea of maybe, hey, give me money and I'll get you free. And so what he did, wherefore he also sent for him the offerer, continued to do more and commune with him. And the whole point was see if he'd be willing now to pay certain money, and because he knew he wasn't worthy of death. But that's what, but he was terrified by what he preached. But I'll just kind of come and we'll talk some more, thinking that eventually he would want to be out of prison and pay him some money and give him money for that exchange. And Paul didn't do that. So that tells you something about his character. It's very self-centered. It's always been that way. And Luke just kind of, here's something that he was doing. And where in the world did Luke get the idea of a motive of another man's heart that he could write that? He's writing by what? Inspiration. God knows our hearts. And he's telling us something that, well, this would be a novel. We just make up a motive because we're the author. But it's interesting. This is what he says about him in such a distinct situation that it's so consistent with what secular history says about him. But he was guided by the Spirit of God. And maybe that guided Paul to know what he's going to preach that day, to expose who this man is and to bring forth his damnation if he doesn't change. But that's what we see as far as the history is concerned. So what we find is that he kind of leaves. He's replaced. You serve so much. Sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's 7, sometimes longer than that. But what happened is that indeed his comes to an end. And so we find in verse 27, when the time had finished, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to gain favor with the Jews, he left Paul in bonds. I want to gain favor with the Jews because I've been overseeing the Jews. I want to stay on friendly terms with them. It's all about him, not about the gospel, not about his soul being saved or anything like that. So we ask the question, number 7. Paul was a prisoner in Caesarea for how long? 5 days? 12? 7 months? A year? 2 years? 3 years? Which was it? He left him for 2 years. To me, that's a long time. We don't know anything that's recorded in the New Testament of his 2 years in Caesarea. Don't know of a letter he wrote. Don't know we know he's able to accept people that came to him. But it was a time when we were not told what happened during those 2 years. But 2 years is a long time to be in prison. And even when you have some freedoms with that. But that's how long he was left there. And he was always calling him to come because he thought he would gain some money from it. But it left him there because it pleased the Jews. And we just go ahead and number 8. He left Paul prisoner in Caesarea because Paul would not bribe for his release. Felix wanted to have favor among the Jews. Paul's accusers from Jerusalem did not arrive. I know y'all loved A, B, and Numbers last week. Well, what do you think about this one? I don't know. I don't want to get caught on that one. But do we know the first two? Can we see those verses right there? He thought he would send him money, hope that with all the money would be given him of Paul, and the idea of being released. We put that together. He wanted money. He wanted to find favor among the Jews. I find that in verse 27. But what about this third one? That's that'd be, if you were overseeing, had rule over other people, being fair in judgment might be a reason, even if you're a selfish person. But if Paul's accusers from Jerusalem did not arrive, is that something that he was waiting for? Yes. Verse 22, Felix, having more exact knowledge concerning the way, deferred them, saying, when Lysias the chief captain shall come down, I will determine your matter. Well, he didn't come. He introduced him with a letter, but he didn't come to tell all the situation about when they kind of captured Paul, imprisoned him to keep him from being killed and torn apart. So I would say A, B, and C, E would be my answer. And that's the reason for it. You got a problem with that. Was there not a bribe involved here? You think you just wanted more money? Why would you want, what are you going to do for me if I give you money? Next step is that free me. Because he didn't determine the situation. He hadn't had enough information yet. And he could have been set free. They could do that. But that didn't happen. Any comments on that, which brings that chapter to a close? If you have your lesson to 22, a little bit behind, if you turn with to chapter 25, we'll move. First of these are identifications anyway. So let's talk about Festus. Let's talk about Agrippa. Let's talk about, we talked a little bit about Bernice or Bernice that we're looking at here. And what do we know about Festus now? We know his name, and is Porcius Festus. And Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and trying to gain favor with the Jews, Felix left Paul in prison. So that was him. And so we're introduced to him. What do we know about him other than this verse 27? He was probably a better ruler over the people than was Felix. He may have a better track record. But we find that he's very industrious in wanting to get into his job. And because we'll find in question number 1 why he comes to Jerusalem, how quick did he get on the job of taking care of Paul's situation. And so he's just coming on the idea of ruling over this province and realized we got to settle this, and he got quickly involved with it. But that's what we know in verse 27 about him. What we're going to see is Agrippa and Bernice. So was this Agrippa the first that comes with Bernice? Do you see we'll call her Bernice, okay? Do you see Bernice and Agrippa? Were they husband and wife like Felix and Drusilla was? It didn't say that. So what do we know? Which Agrippa was this? Is Agrippa the second? It was the brother to Bernice. And there again is going to be this incestuous relationship that history presents to us. And notice it was Felix and Drusilla, his wife. Luke doesn't say that about these two. And you would assume that, I guess, because we just got prepared for Drusilla approaching with Felix. Why wouldn't Bernice, the wife of Agrippa? And so we see some things about her, but that's the brother, Agrippa the second. Agrippa the first, Agrippa the second. He was very young when his father was eaten with worms too, and that becomes a problem that they had to deal with. And so we see here in chapter 25, and with Bernice or Bernice, Josephus speaks a lot about her. She was the eldest daughter of Agrippa the first, and therefore she was the sister to Agrippa the second. And sometimes we just maybe forget about that or didn't know about that, but that's what we see taking place. And so what is interesting is that when you go through her life, see, she was, first of all, married to her uncle, which was another incestuous relationship that was involved. She would leave and be married to a King Ptolemy in the eastern part of Jordan for a while, but she came back to just kind of live with her brother. So she's living with her brother. She gets married, leaves him, comes back and lives with her brother as well. And they carried on this incestuous relationship. Now, they're the ones that need to hear the gospel that Paul preached, but that's what we see taking place with them. So what we're observing here is their character is set forth there. Any comments about who Agrippa was? Wasn't Agrippa the first? He did now. He did with worms. But we have. This is not what I. Well, okay, it'll work, I guess. What request did the Jews ask of Festus in Jerusalem? Why did they ask it? Thank you. So let's get down to what request that they made. So notice he comes to Jerusalem. Why? And I think we asked the question, why did they ask it? But let's just say, why has he come to Jerusalem? Festus, therefore, having come into the province, after 3 days went up to Jerusalem. So he comes to the province that he's overseeing, but in 3 days, he didn't go to Caesarea. Thank you. He goes where? To Jerusalem. And the point is, that's the capital of the province. So he's going to go there to meet with those of the Sanhedrin, so the chief priests, the principal men of the Jews, informed him about something. So what request did they make? What do you think their plan was again? They hadn't forgotten, have they? That's right. And see, on the way we'll kill him. Not when he gets to Jerusalem. Not when he said, on the way we'll kill him. And wasn't that planned by the centurion and the chief captain and so forth? Let's have an army that will accompany you in between. There's 60-something miles between Jerusalem and Caesarea. And the middle-way point is where they stayed. And they would have enough forces at that point when they got out of Jerusalem to protect them from what they planned to do. About 40 men took an oath to kill him. But they would do it on the way. That would be an easier victim to get, wouldn't it? On the way, while they're traveling. Wouldn't be ready for that an ambush, but that's what they were planning. So what happens here is that they asking a favor against him that they would send for him to Jerusalem and laying plot to kill him on the way. Howbeit Festus answered, he wants to rule well, that Paul was kept in charge at Caesarea. He knew that, but he didn't go there first. After 3 days, he may have gone there, I don't know, but after 3 days he's in power. He goes to Jerusalem. And he kept in charge at Caesarea. He's going to be in prison there, and that he himself is about to depart thither shortly. Let them therefore, this saith he, that are the power among you, you Sanhedrin Jews, you leaders of the Jews, you go down with me. I'm going down to Caesarea because Jerusalem is always highest and you're always going down. And he says, And if there's anything amiss in the man, let them accuse him. That's an honorable thing. And that's what they tended to do. So they asked it for a reason. They had a plot to kill him. Again, the various reasons for why they want to hear the gospel, Felix. After said I wanted to hear that. Not necessarily going to change their life. They're wanting money. We want to kill him. Those are things happening, and it's interesting how God's providence works through of getting things done. Not miraculous. Angels don't come down and fight for them. It's just that things work out the way God has already promised. You're going to be bearing witness to me in Rome, just like you did in Jerusalem. So he could spend that Caesarea time knowing that that's not going to be the end of him. So we think of God's providential care. And I don't know if you know this, the man that we're trying to baptize died this week. He was baptized on last Thursday when I was driving back. Found out I was coming back thinking, how am I going to get a place to baptize him? And they got it done in his front yard with a tub. We're thinking about swimming pool or something like that, but got it done, and it wasn't going to. He called and told his brother-in-law, I want you to baptize me at 1 o'clock today, and I want you at Todd's church. And Todd was a Pentecostal preacher. And there's family connected with them. There's family connected with Catholics. And Sharon called me today and said, here there were 3 Catholics and 2 Pentecostals that were demanding that get baptized in the Pentecostal church. Well, Jim, he visited with us, the brother-in-law, said no, he thought maybe his brother-in-law didn't want him to baptize him. No, the brother said, I want you to baptize me. And so Jim sent to his wife the teaching about the one true church. One Pentecostal, one Catholic. And Jim said he was waiting for that to happen. But he didn't know how they were going to do that. But he had 3 grandsons. They had a tub. They put water in it, put him down, baptized him, but they had all 3 help him out. But that was Thursday, I get to remember that. And so we're thankful for that. But then I get a call Monday, what happened over the weekend, he started coughing up blood. She takes him to a hospital nearby in Louisiana and give him a transfusion, send him back in the car, and he dies in the car. And you think about sometimes people holding on, and he wanted that to be done. I visited him in the hospital before I left in the meeting, and he just lying there wanting somehow to get it done. And he almost waited too late. He's known that he's wanted to do that. The wife that he was just living with her at one time. He said, we're going to change her life. They've been married a while, but he never obeyed the gospel. Well, that was taken care of. And I think about God's providence. They had a wreck when they came over here that Saturday afternoons while we didn't baptize him here. He went to the emergency room, ER. He got there, went back to MD Anderson. All the things happening, I couldn't find, he was, well, they all have a tub there. Well, I went to the nursing head and they didn't have one. That's what they said. So I'm worried about that. I decided I was going to buy a swimming pool. I know how deep enough to baptize him in and maybe give it to the kids afterwards. But they had a pretty sufficient tub that they could fill, and he's about 6'4", and he could fit in it. And they baptized him. Well, those people are happy. Jim's in a better place for it. I can see from the gospel his desire was. But what about? There's nothing miraculous in all this. It's just one event after another. And when you have false teaching, they're influencing his family for what he do. He'll be okay. Are they going to sprinkle him as far as the Catholic side of the family? Is he going to get the Holy Ghost baptism? Which one is he going to get for the Pentecostals? No, he was baptized in the name of the Lord, and the preacher Jim got to read the passages. All the grandchildren are there in the front yard watching that. And I just think that's just an interesting thing about God's providence, where he can bring things around. We were praying for him. Church of McKinney was praying for him, all those things. And he lived a few days, and then God took him. I think about this, God's providence of sparing Paul. And that would give Paul some hope that God had already told him, you're going to be with me in Jerusalem. But he had to go through these and then directing him to preach what is needed. Paul was a servant of the Lord. And he overcame the determinate mindset of men. I want to bribe. I want this. We want to get him on a trip back to Jerusalem, kill him. We try to kill him on the way, Caesarea. God doesn't allow that to happen. He allows what his work is going to be done. So we can keep praying and keep doing that. Any comments about this on this question right here? Okay, I do. Okay, good. Well, let me go one more. Why did Festus go to Jerusalem? He came there to meet with the principal men, and I think to establish the fact that he was ready to do his work. So we have to add this one. Festus stayed in Jerusalem for not more than 10 days before returning to Caesarea. True or false? That's true. Verse 6. When he had tarried among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and on the morrow of the next day, after he got there, on the morrow, he sat in the judgment seat and commanded Paul to be brought. I'm overseeing this province, and it wasn't 8 to 10 days at the most. He's back, and then the very next day he's on the job, getting things done. I think it showed he wanted judgment to be done. He wanted justice to be done. He wanted the people to come. So what was absent from the charges that Jews from Jerusalem presented against Paul? They couldn't prove it. They couldn't prove it. And that we'll stop there, and we'll pick up question 5, and I will catch up with questions. And thank you for putting that up there, Norris. Any comments before we close? Okay, thank you.